Victor Reeves stood frozen in disbelief, the crisp autumn air biting against his skin as he stared at the young woman kneeling at his father's grave. She didn't see him at first. Her slender frame was bent low, her trembling hands placing a bouquet of wildflowers, simple yet carefully arranged, on the polished granite headstone. It bore his father's name, Henry Reeves, along with the inscription, "A life devoted to giving, a heart too big to fade." The woman's face was pale and solemn, her lips moving silently as though in prayer. Victor could hear nothing but the whisper of the wind through the towering oaks surrounding the cemetery. He shifted slightly on the gravel path, and the sound made her flinch. She turned, her wide hazel eyes locking onto his, and for a fleeting moment, a flicker of recognition passed between them. It was her. The waitress. Victor's mind reeled. Months ago, he had helped this woman, an anonymous act of charity he had nearly forgotten about. She had been working at a diner in a small town, her exhaustion etched into every movement as she struggled to serve customers. He'd overheard her confide in a coworker about mounting medical bills for her younger brother and how she was on the brink of losing their home. That day, Victor had left a check tucked discreetly into the folds of the receipt, enough to cover her immediate expenses, and then some. He hadn't even signed his name. And now, here she was, standing at his father's grave, looking at him with an expression he couldn't quite decipher. Guilt? Fear? "What are you doing here?" Victor asked, his voice low but firm. He took a step closer, his towering presence contrasting with her smaller stature. Emily Carter, her name tag had said Emily back at the diner, stood quickly, brushing dirt off her hands. Her gaze darted to the headstone, then back to Victor. I was just leaving," she stammered, her voice barely above a whisper. She clutched the straps of her worn canvas bag tightly, as if holding on to a lifeline. Victor's brow furrowed. "Leaving? After visiting my father's grave? Why?" He gestured toward the flowers she had left. "Who are you, and what's your connection to him?" Emily hesitated, her face a storm of conflicting emotions. For a moment, it seemed as though she might answer, but instead, she shook her head and began to step away. "I'm sorry. I shouldn't have come," she murmured. Victor stepped in her path, his frustration mounting. "You can't just show up here, leave flowers, and expect me not to ask questions," he said, his voice growing sharper. "How did you know my father?" Emily's eyes welled with tears, and she looked away, her lips trembling as though she were about to speak. But then she swallowed hard and forced herself to meet his gaze. It's complicated," she said finally. "Please, just let me go." Her words only fueled Victor's determination. There was something about her demeanor, equal parts sorrow and defiance, that struck a chord deep within him. He could feel the weight of an untold story hanging in the air between them, a story that somehow tied her to his father, a man Victor himself had barely understood. Henry Reeves had been a philanthropist, known for his generosity and unwavering commitment to helping those in need. But he had also been a man of secrets, distant and enigmatic even to his own son. Victor had spent years resenting his father's absence, convinced that Henry cared more about strangers than his own family. Now, standing at his grave, confronted by this mysterious woman, Victor realized there was more to his father's life than he had ever imagined. Emily took another step back, her breath hitching. "You have every right to ask questions," she said, her voice cracking. "But I can't give you the answers you're looking for. Not here. Not now." Victor studied her, noting the way her hands trembled despite her attempts to appear composed. She wasn't just hiding something, she was afraid. And for the first time, he wondered if whatever she was keeping from him might be bigger than either of them had anticipated. "Then when?" he asked, his tone softening slightly. "If not now, when?" Emily didn't answer. Instead, she turned and walked away, her footsteps echoing against the quiet stillness of the cemetery. Victor didn't follow. He stood rooted to the spot, staring after her as she disappeared beyond the iron gates, leaving him alone with the unanswered questions swirling in his mind. He turned back to his father's grave, his eyes lingering on the inscription. a heart too big to fade. For the first time, he wondered if those words were more than just a platitude. What had his father done to inspire such devotion from this stranger? And why had Henry never told him? Victor clenched his fists, his breath visible in the chilly air. He wasn't sure what he had just stumbled into, but one thing was clear: this was only the beginning. Whatever secrets his father had taken to the grave, Victor was determined to uncover them, and Emily Carter was the key. Victor couldn't shake the image of Emily Carter from his mind as he left the cemetery. The encounter had stirred something in him, a mix of confusion, suspicion, and a nagging curiosity that refused to let him move on. The world of the wealthy often came with its share of enigmas and connections, but this was different. This wasn't a deal gone awry or a headline scandal. This was deeply personal, tied to the man who had shaped and, in many ways, haunted Victor's life. That evening, Victor sat alone in his sprawling penthouse, the city's glittering skyline stretching out beyond the floor-to-ceiling windows. The soft hum of classical music filled the room, but it barely registered. His thoughts were consumed by the brief yet perplexing interaction at the cemetery. He opened his laptop and typed Emily Carter into the search bar, hoping for a quick and simple explanation. Instead, the results were sparse: a social media account with a handful of posts, most of them years old, and a few mentions in local events, nothing of substance. It was as if she had deliberately kept her life under the radar. Frustrated but unwilling to let it go, Victor picked up his phone and called his assistant, Laura. "I need you to do some digging," he said without preamble. "Of course, Mr. Reeves," Laura replied. "What's the target?" "A woman named Emily Carter. She's a waitress in Brookhaven, small-town diner, struggling financially. I need to know everything about her." There was a pause on the other end of the line before Laura spoke again, her tone cautious. "Is this about business, sir? Or something else?" Victor hesitated. Laura had worked with him for years and knew better than to pry, but even she could sense that this was uncharacteristic. "It's personal," he admitted. "Just find what you can." The call ended, and Victor leaned back in his chair, running a hand through his hair. His gaze drifted to an old photograph on the nearby shelf, a rare picture of him with his father. They were standing on the steps of a community center Henry had helped build, both wearing forced smiles. Victor remembered that day vividly. He had been a teenager, brimming with resentment, dragged along to yet another charity event he wanted no part of. At the time, he couldn't understand why his father poured so much of himself into strangers while neglecting his own family. Now, years later, he wondered if he had been too quick to judge. The next morning, Laura called back with her findings. Emily Carter, 28 years old, originally from Brookhaven, she began. Graduated high school but didn't pursue college. She's been working odd jobs since her teens, mostly waitressing. No criminal record, no significant social connections outside of her family, just a younger brother, Noah Carter, who's been in and out of the hospital for years. Their parents died in a car accident when she was 19. Victor frowned. The pieces were starting to fit together, but not in the way he'd hoped. "What about my father?" he asked. "Is there any connection?" "That's where it gets interesting," Laura said. "There's no direct link I could find, but there's a rumor in Brookhaven. Some locals remember your father visiting the town a few times, years ago. He supposedly donated to a small clinic there, one that treated Noah Carter during a particularly bad episode. But if there's a paper trail, it's buried deep." Victor's grip on the phone tightened. His father, a man who rarely left the city unless it was for high-profile events, had made unpublicized visits to a small, unremarkable town? Why? Laura continued, "I also found something else. Emily's been receiving anonymous financial help for years, payments made to her landlord, hospital bills for her brother, even groceries. All untraceable. It's possible your father was behind it, but there's no way to confirm." Victor ended the call and sat in silence, his thoughts racing. If his father had been quietly supporting Emily's family, why had he never mentioned it? And why was Emily so reluctant to talk about it? Determined to get answers, Victor decided to visit Brookhaven himself. The town was a stark contrast to his usual surroundings, quaint and unassuming, with narrow streets lined by mom-and-pop shops and weathered houses. He parked his sleek black car outside the diner where he had first seen Emily months ago. The bell above the door jingled as he stepped inside, drawing a few curious glances from the regulars. Emily was behind the counter, her back to him as she refilled the coffee pot. She turned, and her expression froze when she saw him. "You're persistent," she said, setting the pot down with more force than necessary. Victor approached the counter, his tone calm but firm. "And you're avoiding the truth." Emily crossed her arms, her posture defensive. "What do you want, Mr. Reeves?" "I want to know why you were at my father's grave," he said bluntly. "And don't tell me it's complicated. I've heard that already." Emily's jaw tightened, and for a moment, Victor thought she might refuse to answer again. But then her shoulders sagged, and she let out a long, weary sigh. "It's not something I can explain in a few words," she said. "If you really want to understand, meet me tonight. 7 o'clock, at the old Brookhaven Library." Victor raised an eyebrow. "Why there?" "Because," Emily said, her voice tinged with both sadness and resolve, "it's where it all began." She didn't offer any more explanation, and Victor knew better than to push. He nodded and left the diner, his mind racing with possibilities. He had come to Brookhaven expecting answers, but it seemed the mystery was only deepening. Whatever secrets Emily Carter was hiding, they were tied to a past Victor had never known, a past that might reshape everything he thought he understood about his father. As he drove away, the small-town streets bathed in the golden glow of late afternoon, Victor couldn't shake the feeling that he was on the brink of uncovering something that would change his life forever. And for the first time in years, he felt a strange mix of apprehension and hope, as though the answers he sought might not only bring the old Brookhaven Library stood at the edge of town, a relic of a bygone era. Its once grand facade was now faded and worn, with ivy creeping up the stone walls and cracked windows that reflected the dim light of a fading sunset. Victor arrived a few minutes early, his breath visible in the crisp evening air. He leaned against his car, watching as the small town streets emptied and the quietness of the night began to settle in. When Emily appeared, she was bundled in a simple coat, her posture tense but determined. She carried a small, worn leather bag slung over her shoulder, and her face was set with the kind of resolve that hinted she was about to step into something she couldn't undo. She didn't greet him, didn't offer a smile or acknowledgement beyond a curt nod. Instead, she walked up the library's steps, keys jingling as she unlocked the heavy wooden doors. Victor followed her inside. The smell of old paper and dust greeted him, along with the faint creak of the floorboards underfoot. The library's interior was dimly lit, with rows of towering bookshelves, casting long shadows. Emily led him to a small alcove at the back, where a single table sat surrounded by mismatched chairs. She set her bag on the table and gestured for Victor to sit. "Before I explain," she began, her voice quiet but steady, "you need to understand that this isn't just about me. It's about your father, his choices, and the kind of man he was. Some of it might be hard to hear." Victor's expression remained stoic, though his curiosity burned brighter with every word. "I'm here to listen," he said simply. Emily opened her bag and pulled out a small stack of papers, along with an old, faded photograph. She slid the photo across the table, toward Victor. He picked it up, his eyes narrowing as he studied the image. It was of a younger Henry Reeves, standing outside what appeared to be a small clinic. Beside him was a woman Victor didn't recognize, a petite brunette with kind eyes and a shy smile. "That's my mother," Emily said, her tone heavy with emotion. Her name was Margaret. She was a nurse at the Brookhaven Community Clinic. "That's where she met your father." Victor looked up sharply. "My father knew your mother?" Emily nodded. "It started as a professional connection. Your father came to Brookhaven years ago, around the time the clinic was struggling to stay open. He'd heard about its financial troubles and decided to help. He donated a significant amount of money, enough to keep the doors open and pay the staff. My mom always said he wasn't like other wealthy donors, he didn't want recognition or anything in return. He just cared. Victor frowned, trying to reconcile this version of his father with the distant, aloof man he had known. Why didn't he ever tell me about this? Because he kept it quiet, Emily said. Even back then, he didn't want people to know. He visited the clinic a few times after that, checking on the staff and the patients. That's when he and my mom became close. Victor's chest tightened. Close? Are you saying they were? No, Emily interrupted quickly, shaking her head. It wasn't like that. My mom admired him, but it was purely platonic. She used to say he carried a lot of weight on his shoulders, like he was trying to atone for something. She never told me what, though. Maybe she didn't know. Victor leaned back in his chair, his mind racing. So he helped the clinic, and he knew your mother. How does this connect to you? Emily hesitated, her fingers brushing against the edges of the papers she'd brought. Years later, after my mom passed away, I found a letter she'd written to me. It explained everything, how your father had stepped in again when I was a kid, when my brother Noah got sick for the first time. The clinic couldn't handle his condition, so your father arranged for him to be transferred to a better hospital. He paid for everything, anonymously. Victor felt a pang of guilt as he thought about the resentment he'd harbored toward his father for so long. He had never imagined the man had been quietly changing lives in ways Victor had never known. Why didn't she tell you while she was alive? Because she didn't want me to feel like I owed anyone anything, Emily said softly. She was proud, and she wanted us to make it on our own. But after she passed, I found out the truth. I didn't know how to feel. Grateful, of course, but also confused. Why would a man like your father go out of his way to help us? We weren't special. We weren't anyone. Victor studied her, his gaze steady. He must have seen something in your family, something worth saving. Emily looked away, her eyes glistening. Maybe. But I think it was more about him than us. He was carrying some kind of burden, something he couldn't fix. Helping us might have been his way of trying to make things right. The room fell silent, the weight of her words settling over them like a thick fog. Victor's mind churned with questions, but one stood out above the rest. Why didn't you tell me any of this at the cemetery? Emily laughed bitterly, wiping at her eyes. Would you have believed me? A random waitress showing up at your father's grave, claiming he helped her family? I didn't think you'd even remember me from the diner, let alone take me seriously. Victor leaned forward, his tone softening. I remember, Emily. And I'm here now because I want to understand. I need to understand. My father and we didn't have the best relationship. He was always so focused on other people, other causes. I resented him for it. But hearing this, seeing what he did for your family, it changes things. Emily nodded slowly, her defenses beginning to lower. I wish I could tell you more, but that's all I know. Your father was a good man, Mr. Reeves. Flawed, maybe, but good. And whether or not he told you, he cared about you. My mom used to say he talked about his son a lot. He was proud of you, even if he didn't always show it. Victor's throat tightened, the unexpected revelation hitting him harder than he anticipated. He stood, needing a moment to process everything. Thank you for telling me, he said finally. I won't forget this. Emily watched him as he turned to leave, her expression a mix of relief and sadness. Mr. Reeves, she called after him. He paused, glancing back. For what it's worth, she said, I think he would have wanted you to know. Victor nodded, the weight of her words settling into his chest as he stepped out into the cool night air. He looked up at the stars, a sense of clarity beginning to take shape. This was only the beginning of the story, his father's story, Emily's story, and maybe even his own. Victor drove back to his hotel, the night stretching before him in silence, but his mind was anything but quiet. Emily's revelations weighed heavily, reframing the man he had spent years resenting. Every memory of his father now seemed layered with hidden depth, motives he hadn't considered, and an ache he couldn't quite name. By the time he reached his room, the weight of exhaustion hit him, but sleep felt like an impossibility. Instead, he poured himself a glass of whiskey, the amber liquid catching the dim light of the bedside lamp, and settled into a chair by the window. The view was unremarkable, small town streets lit by sporadic streetlights, the quiet life that Henry Reeves had apparently once touched without his son ever knowing. Victor couldn't stop wondering about the gaps in Emily's story. His father wasn't a man who did things halfway. If he had helped Emily's family, there had to be more to the connection, more to the story. And what about the anonymous financial aid that had kept coming long after Henry had passed? Who was responsible for that? The next morning, he decided he needed more answers. Brookhaven was a small town, and small towns had a way of holding on to secrets. If anyone knew more about his father's time here, it would be someone connected to the clinic. He found the Brookhaven Community Clinic after a short drive. It was a modest, single-story building with peeling paint and a sign that looked like it hadn't been updated in decades. Inside, the smell of antiseptic and faint coffee lingered. The waiting area was sparsely populated, with tired chairs and a stack of outdated magazines on a small table. A woman in her 60s sat at the reception desk, her graying hair pulled back into a neat bun. She looked up as Victor approached, her eyes narrowing slightly in recognition. "You're Henry Reeves's boy," she said, her voice tinged with surprise. Victor blinked, caught off guard. "You knew my father?" "Everyone here knew your father," she replied, leaning back in her chair. "He saved this place more than once." "I'm Ruth, by the way, been working here since before you were born." Victor offered a polite nod. "Ruth, I'm trying to understand my father's connection to this town and the people here. Specifically, the Carter family." Ruth's expression softened, and she gestured for him to follow her. She led him down a hallway to a small office cluttered with file boxes and a desk covered in paperwork. She motioned for him to sit. "Your father was a good man," Ruth began, settling into her chair. "He didn't make a big show of it, but he cared. Margaret Carter, Emily and Noah's mother, was one of our best nurses. She had a way with people, always knew how to make them feel at ease. When her husband died in that car accident, Henry stepped in. He paid for the funeral, made sure the clinic had the resources we needed to keep her employed while she was raising 2 kids on her own. That was the kind of man he was." Victor listened intently, his throat tightening as he tried to process this new side of his father. "And after Margaret passed?" Ruth hesitated, her expression turning somber. "That was hard on everyone. Emily was just a teenager then, barely holding it together. Noah's health was already fragile, and without Margaret, things went downhill fast. That's when the anonymous donations started showing up. We always assumed it was Henry, but he never admitted it outright. After he passed, the money kept coming, but no one ever figured out who was behind it." Victor leaned forward, his mind racing. "And you're certain my father was involved in all of this? There wasn't anyone else?" Ruth gave him a knowing look. "Your father wasn't the type to involve himself in something unless it mattered to him. And the Carters mattered. Margaret, Emily, Noah, they weren't just a charity case to him. He saw something in them, something worth fighting for." Victor sat back, the weight of her words pressing down on him. He had spent years believing his father was too preoccupied with his causes to care about his own family, yet here was proof that Henry Reeves had been quietly building connections and changing lives. "Thank you, Ruth," he said finally, standing. "This means more to me than you know." Ruth smiled faintly, her eyes soft with understanding. "Your father would be proud of you, you know. Coming here, trying to understand, it's more than most people would do." Victor left the clinic with a strange mix of emotions, pride in his father's legacy, regret for the years of resentment that had blinded him to it, and a deepening curiosity about the threads that tied everything together. But one question still nagged at him: who had continued the financial support after his father's death? If Henry hadn't been the only one helping the Carters, then who else was involved? That evening, Victor found himself driving back to the cemetery. The sun was setting, casting long shadows across the gravestones. He parked his car and walked to his father's grave, the cool breeze rustling the leaves of a nearby tree. As he stood there, lost in thought, he heard the sound of footsteps behind him. Turning, he saw Emily approaching, her expression unreadable. "I thought I might find you here," she said softly, stopping a few feet away. Victor nodded, his gaze shifting back to the headstone. "I've learned more about my father in the past 2 days than I did in my entire life." Emily stepped closer, her voice gentle. "He wasn't perfect, Victor. None of us are. But he cared, in his own way. And I think he wanted you to know that, even if he didn't know how to show it." Victor sighed, running a hand through his hair. "I just wish I had understood him sooner. Maybe things would have been different." Emily placed a hand on his arm, her touch light but grounding. "What matters is that you're here now. You're trying to understand, and that means something." Victor turned to look at her, his expression earnest. "There's still so much I don't know." "The anonymous support after he died, do you have any idea who could have been behind it?" Emily hesitated, her gaze dropping to the ground. "I've wondered about that too. I always assumed it was someone connected to your father, but I never found out who. Maybe it's someone who believed in what he stood for." The mystery remained unsolved, but for the first time, Victor felt a sense of peace. His father's legacy wasn't just about the choices he had made, it was about the lives he had touched, the people who had carried his values forward. As the last rays of sunlight disappeared, leaving the cemetery bathed in twilight, Victor made a silent vow to honor his father's memory. He would uncover the rest of the truth, not just for himself, but for the people his father had cared about. And in doing so, he hoped to finally bridge the gap between the man Henry Reeves had been and the man Victor was striving to become. Victor's mind churned as he drove back to the hotel under the cover of darkness, the car's headlights slicing through the quiet night. Emily's words lingered in his thoughts, her unwavering belief that his father's actions, though imperfect, were driven by genuine care. But the unanswered questions gnawed at him, particularly the mystery of the anonymous benefactor. The story wasn't complete, and Victor had never been one to leave loose ends untied. The next morning, with a renewed determination, he made his way to the Brookhaven Archives, a modest building near the town center. Inside, the musty air and rows of filing cabinets reminded him of the weight of forgotten histories waiting to be uncovered. If there was a record of donations to the clinic or any clue about the mysterious support for the Carters, it would be here. A middle-aged man with glasses perched low on his nose greeted him from behind a desk. "Help you with something?" Victor nodded, offering a polite smile. "I'm looking into my father's connection to the town. Henry Reeves. I understand he contributed to the clinic and helped some families here. I was hoping to find records of donations or anything related to his time in Brookhaven." The man raised an eyebrow. "Henry Reeves, huh? You're his son?" "Yes," Victor said, noticing the flicker of recognition in the man's expression. "Well, you've come to the right place. Your father's name pops up in a lot of the old community records. Let me pull what we've got." Victor watched as the man disappeared into the rows of filing cabinets, his footsteps echoing softly. Minutes later, he returned with a stack of folders and set them on the desk. "Here's everything we have," he said. "You're welcome to look through it. If you need copies, let me know." Victor nodded his thanks and began sifting through the documents. The records confirmed much of what he already knew. Henry Reeves had donated generously to the clinic and other local causes, always anonymously. But as Victor delved deeper, a name kept appearing alongside his father's, Daniel Harper. Victor's brow furrowed. Daniel Harper was a name he didn't recognize, but the records suggested he had worked closely with Henry during his time in Brookhaven. There were mentions of joint donations, meetings, and even correspondence between the two. Intrigued, Victor decided to track him down. A quick inquiry at the archives revealed that Daniel Harper still lived in Brookhaven, running a small bookstore on the outskirts of town. Victor drove there immediately, the prospect of uncovering more about his father driving him forward. The bookstore was a cozy, unassuming place, its sign weathered but welcoming. Inside, the scent of aged paper and polished wood filled the air. Behind the counter stood a man in his late 60s, his hair silver and neatly combed, wearing a pair of reading glasses as he sorted through a pile of books. "Mr. Harper?" Victor asked as he approached the counter. The man looked up, his eyes sharp and curious. "Yes? Can I help you?" "My name is Victor Reeves. I'm Henry Reeves's son." Recognition dawned on Daniel's face, followed by a flicker of something unreadable, perhaps nostalgia or pain. He set the books aside and gestured for Victor to sit in a nearby armchair. "Well, this is unexpected," Daniel said, settling into a chair opposite Victor. "It's been years since anyone mentioned Henry to me. How can I help you?" Victor explained everything, the revelations about his father's involvement with the Carters, the anonymous donations, and his desire to piece together the full story. Daniel listened intently, his expression thoughtful. "Your father was a remarkable man," Daniel said after a long pause. "He didn't just help this town financially. He believed in its people, in their potential. That's why he and I worked together on so many projects. He saw what others overlooked." "And the Carters?" Victor pressed. "What was his connection to them?" Daniel sighed, leaning back in his chair. "Margaret Carter was a special case. She wasn't just a nurse, she was the heart of that clinic. Henry admired her dedication, her resilience. When her husband passed, Henry stepped in because he knew she couldn't do it alone. But it was more than charity. I think he saw her as a symbol of what he wanted to be, a selfless person who made a difference." "And after he died?" Victor asked. The donations continued. "Was that you?" Daniel hesitated, his gaze dropping to the floor. "Partly," he admitted. "Henry and I had an arrangement. He set up a fund before he passed, ensuring the Carters would have support as long as they needed it. But when the fund ran low, I stepped in. It felt like the right thing to do. Henry would have wanted it that way." Victor felt a surge of gratitude and something deeper, respect for both his father and the man who had carried on his work. "Why didn't you tell anyone?" "Because Henry wanted it that way," Daniel said simply. "He didn't do what he did for recognition. He believed in quiet generosity. I respected that." Victor nodded, the pieces of the puzzle finally falling into place. His father's legacy wasn't just about the money he had given or the lives he had touched, it was about the values he had instilled in others, the quiet ripple effect of his kindness. As Victor left the bookstore, the weight of his father's story settled over him, but it no longer felt like a burden. Instead, it felt like a call to action, a responsibility to honor the man his father had been by living those same values. Back at the hotel that evening, Victor opened his laptop and began drafting a letter. It wasn't for public eyes or even for Emily. It was for himself, a way to process everything he had learned and to solidify his commitment to continuing his father's legacy. "Dear Dad," he wrote, the words flowing more easily than he expected. "I didn't understand you when you were here. I resented you for your distance, for the way you seemed to prioritize others over your own family. But now, I see the truth. You were building something bigger than yourself, something bigger than us. And for that, I am proud to be your son." Victor didn't know what the future held, but for the first time, he felt ready to embrace it. His father's story was no longer a mystery, it was a guide, a legacy he was determined to carry forward. Victor returned to Brookhaven a week later, armed with a sense of purpose that had been absent from his life for years. He had spent the days since leaving the town reflecting on everything he had learned, about his father, about Emily and her family, and about the quiet ways in which lives can intertwine. But what lingered most was the feeling that there was still more to be done, not just for his father's memory, but for the people his father had cared for so deeply. He pulled into the driveway of Emily's modest home late in the afternoon. The house seemed livelier this time, with the sound of a dog barking in the backyard and a small garden blooming along the edge of the porch. Emily opened the door, surprise flickering across her face as she saw him standing there. "Victor?" she asked, stepping outside. "I didn't expect to see you again so soon." "I couldn't leave things unfinished," he said, offering a small smile. "There's something I need to talk to you about." "May I come in?" Emily hesitated briefly before nodding. She led him into the cozy living room, where a soft throw blanket was draped over the couch, and a stack of books sat on the coffee table. Victor noticed the framed photos on the mantel, some of Emily with her late mother and Noah, others of her at various milestones in her life. It struck him how much strength she must have had to keep going through so much loss. As they sat down, Victor took a deep breath. "I've spent the past week learning more about my father than I thought was possible. And through everything I've discovered, one thing has become clear: he believed in you and your family. He saw something in you that mattered, something worth investing in." Emily's expression softened, though there was a guardedness in her eyes. "Your father did so much for us. I'll never be able to repay him for what he gave." Victor shook his head. "It's not about repayment. It's about continuing his legacy. He didn't just help your family, he believed in giving people a chance, in lifting them up so they could stand on their own. And I want to do the same." Emily frowned slightly, confused. "What are you saying?" Victor leaned forward, his voice steady. "I've decided to create a foundation in my father's name. A foundation that will provide support to families like yours, people who need a helping hand to get back on their feet. It'll be focused on communities like Brookhaven, places that often get overlooked but are full of people with untapped potential." Emily's eyes widened, and she sat back in her chair. "A foundation? That's huge, Victor. But why involve me?" "Because you're part of the reason I'm doing this," he admitted. "Your story, your resilience, it inspired me. And I want you to help me shape this foundation. Who better to guide it than someone who understands what it's like to be on the receiving end of that kind of support?" Emily looked at him for a long moment, her expression a mix of surprise, gratitude, and hesitation. "I don't know what to say. This is all so overwhelming." "You don't have to decide now," Victor said gently. "Take your time. Think about it. But I believe in you, Emily. Just like my father did." For the next few days, Victor stayed in Brookhaven, immersing himself in the community. Each conversation reinforced his determination to make the foundation a reality. By the end of the week, Emily called him. They met at the same diner where their journey had begun, sitting in the corner booth as the late afternoon sun streamed through the windows. "I've thought about what you said," Emily began, her hands wrapped around a cup of coffee. "And if you're serious about this foundation, I'd like to be part of it. But only if it's about more than just money. I want to make sure it's something that truly helps people, something that honors your father's legacy." Victor smiled, relief and pride washing over him. "That's exactly what I want. And with your help, I know we can make it happen." Over the following months, Victor and Emily worked tirelessly to bring the foundation to life. They named it the Henry Rees Initiative, a tribute to the man whose quiet generosity had sparked their efforts. With Daniel Harper's expertise, Ruth's deep ties to the community, and Emily's passion, the foundation quickly gained traction. They began by funding programs for local clinics, supporting single parents, and providing scholarships for students in need. As the initiative grew, Victor found himself changing in ways he hadn't anticipated. For years, he had been driven by ambition and the desire to prove himself, but now, his focus shifted to something greater. He saw the impact of his efforts in the faces of the people they helped, in the child who received medical care their family couldn't afford, in the single mother who got a second chance, and in the community that began to thrive under their support. One day, months after the foundation's launch, Victor stood at his father's grave again. This time, he wasn't there out of obligation or confusion. He was there to honor the man who had set everything in motion. "I understand now," he said softly, placing a hand on the headstone. "I understand what you were trying to do, and I hope I'm making you proud." As he stood there, a sense of peace washed over him. His father's legacy wasn't just a story of the past, it was alive, shaping the future in ways neither of them could have imagined. And for the first time in his life, Victor felt truly connected to the man he had once struggled to understand. Each conversation reinforced his determination to make the foundation a reality. By the end of the week, Emily called him. They met at the same diner where their journey had begun, sitting in the corner booth as the late afternoon sun streamed through the windows. "I've thought about what you said," Emily began, her hands wrapped around a cup of coffee. "And if you're serious about this foundation, I'd like to be part of it. But only if it's about more than just money. I want to make sure it's something that truly helps people, something that honors your father's legacy." Victor smiled, relief and pride washing over him. "That's exactly what I want. And with your help, I know we can make it happen." Over the following months, Victor and Emily worked tirelessly to bring the foundation to life. They named it the Henry Rees Initiative, a tribute to the man whose quiet generosity had sparked their efforts. With Daniel Harper's expertise, Ruth's deep ties to the community, and Emily's passion, the foundation quickly gained traction. They began by funding programs for local clinics, supporting single parents, and providing scholarships for students in need. As the initiative grew, Victor found himself changing in ways he hadn't anticipated. For years, he had been driven by ambition and the desire to prove himself, but now, his focus shifted to something greater. He saw the impact of his efforts in the faces of the people they helped, in the child who received medical care their family couldn't afford, in the single mother who got a second chance, and in the community that began to thrive under their support. One day, months after the foundation's launch, Victor stood at his father's grave again. This time, he wasn't there out of obligation or confusion. He was there to honor the man who had set everything in motion. "I understand now," he said softly, placing a hand on the headstone. "I understand what you were trying to do, and I hope I'm making you proud." As he stood there, a sense of peace washed over him. His father's legacy wasn't just a story of the past, it was alive, shaping the future in ways neither of them could have imagined. And for the first time in his life, Victor felt truly connected to the man he had once struggled to understand.